Right, okay, John, thanks for joining us. So John's regarded as one of the grand masters of science fiction illustration. So where did it all begin, John? Where did it all start?
Oh, uh,
Hmm.
well, I went through art college fiddling around with images that were related vaguely to the whole idea of space.
Hmm.
And I didn't really know what to do with it. I didn't have an angle on which to sort of launch image making, really. And it
Hmm.
wasn't until, about 3 or 4 years after I left art college that I began to connect my feelings, if you like, my feelings of space and the planet and all the rest of it with imagery. And it really was, it, it was catalyzed by the image of the Earth from space. Because
Hmm.
I'm of an age which I was 21 on the day that they landed on the moon.
Hmm.
Oh, actually, a week before, sorry. And it had a huge impact on me. It wasn't about the science.
Hmm.
It was a sense of identity and a sense of being where I am on the planet. You know, that
Yeah.
whole perspective,
Yeah.
perspective thing. Um, and it grew naturally out of that sense of perspective
Hmm.
thing, really. And I started to read. Well, I had been reading people like Arthur C. Clarke and Kurt Vonnegut and all those guys,
Hmm.
and was absolutely mesmerized by the the vision of what they had in their heads.
Yeah.
So that's really how it all started.
Hmm. There's always a great sense of scale in your paintings, I always felt, and is that all part of the same thing? Because everything seems to be, it always seems to be framed as well as part of a larger thing, as though there's a much bigger thing just off camera almost.
Yes, yes, this is crucial, I think. Yeah, this comes down, to the sense of perspective. I can't remember when it began, but way back in my childhood,
Hmm.
I always had this sense of the canopy of the sky.
Yeah.
And I must have had a little bit of an aberration in terms of being able to understand the scale of things, because I can remember at the age of 5, we lived in on the Surrey-Sussex border, where they used to frequently, this was not long after the war, they used
Hmm.
to frequently do jet trail trials over our house,
Yeah.
the sound barrier and all that sort of stuff, with those old
Hmm.
electrics.
Yeah.
And the thing that I had when I was 5 years old, I remember hearing these things go over and going back into the house and getting a chair and putting it on the lawn, climbing up onto the chair to see if I could catch this. I obviously had a loose connection somewhere. You know, I couldn't actually quite quite get the of it.
Yeah.
I have a feeling that there's something there that is just my brain is very oddly wired. And I don't know how it actually developed, but the sense of scale to me is inseparable from a bodily sensation of I kind of almost floating.
Yeah. Yeah.
Very difficult to talk about these things. They are so visual, but I've always had it. And I can't tell you what it is that enables me to make it work. I mean, there are obvious clues, there are obvious little things
Hmm.
one can do, which are very, anybody could pick up. But there's something beyond that, which is to do with the sense of atmosphere, the way that detail tends to dissolve with distance, or
Hmm.
characteristics. I never think about it. I just do it flying by the seat of my pants, as it were, and it just feels,
Yeah.
it's very difficult to talk about, really.
No, I understand. I mean, it's difficult for me to because I was trying to write down some questions. it's so your work's like immediately identifiable as John Harris, and I think the big difference is with many other illustrators, you tend to get they tend to go for black skies, everything's sort of super saturated, spaceships that look like racing cars. You get
Yeah.
that sort of glossy look. Everything's really precise.
Mm.
Whereas yours almost looks like it's underwater. You get that sort of that floating thing again, don't you? And the atmosphere, and it's ethereal and misty, and
Well, absolutely. And in fact, that in that simple thing of softening, uh, there's a wonderful line in the Tao Te Ching. I don't know whether you know that literature, but anyway, it's a piece of Taoist literature, which says, "Soften the light, untie the tangles, become one with the dusty world." That's the
okay. And I'm not familiar with that,
uh,
but yeah,
and it's a sort of it's a feeling of not looking too closely
yeah,
that actually then the gut feelings can operate much more effectively if you're not pinned down into imprisoned into a set of values which are very difficult to break out of once you've created them.
yeah.
This may sound very airy fairy, but that's exactly what it is. Airy.
Well, you studied meditation for a few years, didn't you? Did that have any sort of impact on your art at all?
Yeah, hugely. I mean, there's no way really I can separate my sense of creativity with
Mm,
the practice of meditation. It's so deeply bound up with it because what the meditation enables one to do, as far as I can see, after 50 years, I suppose I ought to be able to talk about it.
mm,
What meditation enables you to do is to pick up very subtle clues in the mind
mm.
about your inner state.
Right.
Yeah. And the effect when you're looking at something, for me, I go through these very subtle filters. This is extremely difficult to talk about because it's the whole thing is the moment that you talk about it, you're trying to imprison it.
Yeah. I see what you mean. Yeah.
And that immediately locks you down into a very mundane kind of reality. But all I can say is that the practice of meditation has enabled me to have access to subtler levels of feeling than I might otherwise have.
Right, I see.
Yeah,
Hmm.
that makes sense.
Yeah, yeah.
Hmm.
How did all this lead to a career in illustration? Where did all that begin?
Yeah. After I left art college, I went off to do things to do with meditation, really, and see the world. And when I came back from that, about 3 or 4 years later, this was in the. You have to remember, this was the very first part of the 70s.
Ah, right.
But he'd gone on the road, and I came back to England. And I thought, and I really need to earn a living, And
Mm,
I looked at the various sort of smudges and bits of graphic work that I'd done over the last 2 or 3 years before then, and I thought this actually is something that seems to have a kind of a cachet. It seems to have a, how to put it. There were people who locked onto it and they recognized something there.
yeah,
Oh, well, I mean, why not go up to London and see if I can, make a living with it, and I
yeah.
literally did that.
Hmm,
I went first to an advertising agency who said, yes, 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 very exciting, but it's not our stuff.
hmm.
Then I went to see Alison Eldred, who I have remained with for 50 years nearly.
Well,
And it was quite funny because she wasn't sure that she could place this stuff, when I first showed it to her.
yeah,
But there was another guy who was working with her called Mick Jarvis, who a terrific guy who was a mountaineer, and he saw more clearly, I think, than anybody, um, the language that dealt with scale and so on, probably from his own experience as a mountaineer.
yeah,
He tragically died on a mountain, actually, about 10 years later. But anyway, he uh, he encouraged Alison to put the boat out a bit, and
mm,
did. And I was taken up by it was a character called Paul Dunn, I think that's right, who was a publisher, and he saw the sort of cinemascopic nature of the stuff that I do, and he had this great
mm,
idea of having a double square image as a collection of images in a book, just double square images.
mm,
And my work was perfectly suited for that.
mm,
And I just flew with it, and I never looked back. Mm.
mm. Was a large, to my mind anyway, like an architectural and structural quality to your work as well? Were you ever interested in being an architect or anything like that?
Yeah, I love architecture. I did do a lot of stuff with that when I was at art college. And I think for me, the shape of architecture is very close. The definition of architecture, I think, is very much of concrete dreaming.
Yeah.
Uh,
Mhm.
it's sort of it was a natural uh, partner to the kind of imagery of technology, and the idea of spaceships and all that sort of stuff. You almost can hardly think of spaceships without thinking of architecture. There's a sort
Yeah,
of
that's very true.
tremendously intimate connection between the two.
Mm,
And yeah, so it was very effortless for me to generate these sort of structures, which just brought out a little bit more that sense of scale and
mm.
create a kind of human connection. Um, yeah, that's
Yeah.
much I can say about that, really.
What's your normal process? Let's say you get a commission. How much would you look into the source material before you started a piece, let's say?
I'm sorry, but I have a terrible reputation here. I'm going to bury myself now because I have a terrible reputation for completely ignoring the brief. It's ironic because I know what they want.
Yeah.
But, they don't, and this sounds terrible and arrogant and all the rest of it, but what the hell? I know what they want.
Yeah.
And I know that if they come to me, that's what they're after, so I
Yeah.
do it. And I mean, Alison will tell you all of this, that actually been known more than once to sort of completely ignore the brief and go in exactly the opposite direction, and that's all I can say about it, really, without burying myself really deeply.
Do you tend to work straight to the canvas, or do you do any sketches before you start a piece? What's your
Yeah.
normal process?
Yes. A little while ago, I had to give a talk to a group of students in Italy, actually,
Mm.
about my process, and I was desperately trying to think of something that I could say, and I was put in the spot, where I was sitting in front of 500 students or whatever, and they were asking me to do a drawing.
Right.
you know, and I mean, it's not the most favorable position to be in, that sort of thing,
Yeah.
but I kind of met it by saying, look, the only way that I know how to proceed with a drawing is to make a mess.
Mm.
This was very much the kind of approach that when you went to art college in the 60s, that was the sort of approach, to break down the barriers,
Mm,
conceptualism and all of that sort of stuff, and just go for a mess. And I did this a great deal over a period of 3 or 4 years when I was at art college. And I learned to, well, the way I put it is, once I've made a mess on a pristine surface,
mm,
I've found a way of dreaming into it. Uh, I can't really make it any clearer than that, except to say that I'm looking for faint clues with
mm.
marks that suggest the medium that I'm trying to resolve.
I can see what you mean. Yeah.
Yeah. And it could be, the granular character of cartridge paper,
Mm,
scraping charcoal across the nap of the paper and so on. And you get all these sort of little incidental bits, tiny bits of detail in a mush of, softness. And it's like it's the material out of which I generate the space.
yeah, I see.
So it's a very organic and as as little as possible thought goes into it.
Right.
Little as possible. Because, there really is, I know this might sound very airy-fairy, but I really do feel that we're kind of like nodules on the top of something, that our intelligence is actually only there really to sort out the nuts and bolts of things. That actually the real intelligence behind the poetry, the art, whatever you like to call it,
Mm,
is a hidden, almost silent thing.
yeah,
And it's in the realm of feeling and not of thought.
yeah. How do you come up with your? How did you develop your palettes? Because your palettes are very sort of again, they're not atypical sort of science fiction palettes, are they? They're sort of very sort of muted and
Yes.
yeah, they're sort of cold colors, aren't they?
Yeah, that they are. I think over the years that I've been working commercially, I've learned to avoid the monochromatic, but at the same time, when I when I'm generating an image, I tend to use unison pastels. Now, the unison pastels, I don't know whether you know about them, but
Mm,
they have a stunning collection. The chromatic scale of the unison pastels is second to none. It's absolutely tremendous. And I tend to have my pastels out and lying around higgledy-piggledy,
right.
and I sort of pass them by on my way to a cup of tea or something, and I look at them, and there might be a combination of color just that's in accident lying on the gray sponge of the base of the box, you know what I mean?
Mm,
And it gives me a little kick, and I think
mm,
nice combination that. And it it starts like that, it's an aesthetic decision, which is then very rapidly replaced by a more emotional thing about what the image is going to be.
yeah,
So I allow the image to tell me to some degree what it demands of me.
yeah.
But I have to say that I'm also very, very um, vulnerable to an aesthetic kick.
Mm.
I remember as an art student constantly being berated for this. You can't do that. It's not, and all that sort of stuff. But I've always said, well, stuff that. So I go for what pleases me. And more often than not, this sort of soft palette, which comes largely from the chromatic scales of the pastels, um, actually generates a much more inward poetic response to the image than anything else.
Yeah,
I have been, I mean, one of the things that I've noticed, and I think this has happened largely as a consequence of the artificiality of image making currently, and the whole thing of computer generated imagery and all the rest of it. This lack of of the human harmony. You know, this lack of
Mm,
it's all very abrasive and upfront and in your face, you know.
mm,
And when I'm trying to generate an image, I'm trying to generate a sense of depth, almost, well, of dreaming, you know, this sort of uh, a sensitivity, if you like, to what it is that you're looking at, you know.
yeah.
And you can do that with very, very high-end energetic color. I don't think you can do it. If you can, it's not something I've learned yet to do.
So, talking about that, would you say that the emergence of digital art, it was probably at the end of the 1990s, really, wasn't it, when it first started to be really prominent? Do you think it's had a really negative effect on illustration as a whole?
Wow, that's a difficult question because I don't know how to do it. So, I mean, I don't know really, except to say that I think that for me, I I rely entirely on my humanness,
Right,
you know,
right.
to create it. That's all I can say about that, really. I don't,
Yeah.
you know.
Would you say that your techniques changed over time, and if so, I mean, obviously ours over time, but what significantly do you think you changed in terms of the way you go about painting?
Yeah, well, that's quite an interesting point for me, actually, because there's an example of it in the new book that I produced last year.
Hmm.
There is actually a picture which became quite well known called FTL1, the building of FTL1.
Hmm.
And it was one of those pictures that that character Philip Dunn, not Paul Dunn, Philip Dunn, commissioned me to do. He gave me the brief, which was it was completely open, but I chose to make this image of the building of a faster than light ship, you know,
Hmm.
the very first faster than light ship. And I used shellac inks at that time, which was a
Hmm.
travesty of a technique. I don't recommend it to anybody. But anyway, it was I was astonished when I looked back at it about 10 or 15 years later, and the amount of detail that I'd actually put into this picture, which was to do largely with the material that I was using, which was shellac ink with the finest brush and
Hmm.
airbrushing, you know,
Yeah.
that sort of stuff. And it worked um, it, to the extent that, that the image worked at all, um, because of the relationship between large areas of blankness and soft, sharp areas, soft, sharp, you know, um, little bits of machinery and all of that sort of thing. Um, it worked relatively well, but then, as happens with all of the shellac ink paintings, they faded over a period of time,
Hmm.
much to my embarrassment, because a lot of people had spent a lot of money
Yeah.
ringing me up, you know, 20 years later saying, your picture's disappeared, you know, because they fade so quickly, you know.
Hmm.
So anyway, I had abandoned that technique quite early on in my career, within about 3 or 4 years, because it just was not sustainable. And I started using acrylics.
Right.
And then from acrylics, it became quite obvious that the only real way to do this was to do it in oil paint. You
Yeah.
know, oil paint has such the most amazing flexibility and the softness you can get as well as the sharp. It's just a fantastic medium, you know.
Yeah.
And so I got rid of acrylics and started to use oil paint. And one of the lovely things about oil paint is you don't need an airbrush because it's the easiest thing in the world to have soft transitions and all
Hmm.
that thing, you know. And also, you know, you've got a little bit of body there which you can brush over and create all sorts of interesting techniques, textures, I mean. So anyway, then about, oh, I suppose it must have been about 10 years ago, maybe a little earlier, maybe 5 or 6 years ago, I'm not sure. I was looking at these pictures and thinking they no longer exist, these old pictures, the ones that have been done in shellac. I
Hmm.
thought, why not repaint them in oil, you know, and
Hmm.
this time do it on canvas, a 6 foot canvas by 4 foot, it's not around, And so I did, and I did actually do that image um, at that scale in oil. And when the book was published last year, well, just before the book was published, I was looking at all of the stuff that was going to go in the book, and I was thinking the difference in the image of the first FTL1 image that I did in 2000, what was it, 1980, 1976,
Mm,
1976, my God. And it was actually seen by Ridley Scott, before he did Blade Runner, and that was all connected to that.
mm,
Uh, anyway, the point was that I looked then at the large scale oil painting, and then back at the old picture of FTL1, and I realized that it perfectly represented the change in me over that period of time, from being
mm.
a 25-year-old spotty youth, to a rather disgruntled old man. Not disgruntled at all. But anyway, the point was that it was clearly evident to me that the process of aging
Mm,
is mirrored perfectly in the art, and
yeah,
both ways. And the new picture of FTL1 is a rather soft, almost, I wouldn't say melancholic, but it's more thoughtful. It's more mature,
yeah.
and I have to say I much prefer it. Otherwise, I'd be really depressed. But
Do,
no,
do you, do you take anything from classical painters? I see a lot of Turner in your work, for example.
yeah, yeah, of course, Turner. I mean, the thing about Turner, I think, that still is it's still revolutionary and will always be, I suppose, is
Mm,
exactly the same point about me making a mess, you know.
mm,
He knew how to beat up a picture and be completely disrespectful of concept of technique. Completely disrespectful. And it worked for him,
mm,
and I think uh, even though I never consciously tried to ape him in any way, I'm sure that his leadership in that kind of bravery of how to deal with the material. Actually, you can see it in Rembrandt too. I mean, you look at Rembrandt
mm,
and his portraits closely, and they're really like looking at a Turner. They really are. I mean, the amount of obviously using the back of his hand half the time, and
mm.
the back end of a brush too, to dig into impasto paint and all that sort of stuff. That was what Turner used to do as well. And it's what I learned to do. And I think, not to compare myself to those two, but it is a wonderfully uh, fertile way of creating imagery, I think.
Yeah. Hmm. You've had quite a lot of contact with NASA, haven't you? You've had a partnership with NASA a couple of times. How did all those come together?
Yeah, that's really weird, actually, because there wasn't. I mean, I think I've already written about this in another book years ago, but it was 1983, or sorry, 1984. I went to the States, and I was invited by this character called Bob Schulman, who ran what was called the NASA art program.
Hmm.
He invited various illustrators and painters to contribute to a sort of museum collection of work that related to the space effort.
Yeah.
And it's actually, there's a really weird story in connection to this, which I have mentioned to other people, but I may as well tell you if you've
Hmm.
got time, which is that I went over there to do a drawing and do some, lots of photographs of the launch site and so on. And this character, Bob Schulman, he was tremendous actually. He just said, "You do whatever it is you want to do. Just we'll arrange for you to go right up to the rocket site. You can actually
Hmm.
walk on rockets and all the rest of it. We did all of this. There were four of us altogether, myself and three other Americans. And I didn't really do very much sketching or drawing when I was there, but I watched the launch.
Mm.
That was the main, the high spot of the whole thing. And I was very struck by well, you can't get closer than 2 miles to the launch.
Right. Yeah.
Otherwise, you go green or yellow or something like that. And you're covered in poisonous gas. Apart from being cooked. It is incredible, and it always happens at dawn, or it did then. And it was the viewing platform was positioned in such a way that the sun would be behind the gantry, which the shuttle was resting on.
Mm.
And it made for the most amazing dramatic sight when the sun would come up and it's sort of marshland between you and the rocket. And it's nearly always a little bit misty, and so on. And this sun would come up and the gantry would be silhouetted against the sun. It was just beautiful, really stunning.
Mm.
And then the countdown and then this thing would go up. Um, and of course, when it ignites, there is a moment at the very beginning, the first ignition of the gases.
Mm.
You get this fantastic tangerine glow everywhere.
Mm.
All the people who are sitting beside you and everywhere around you, all the entire landscape is covered in this sort of tangerine glow. It's incredibly impressive.
Mm.
This thing goes up, and I had a camera, and I was stupid enough. Never mind. I was stupid enough to photograph at the moment of ignition. And I only wished I'd had the sense to let myself see it first and then take the photograph.
Right.
It's such a crucial point there, but that's by the by. Anyway, the thing is, the thing went up,
Yeah.
and I came back to England, and I looked at all of the imagery that I'd made and all the rest of it, and the photographs and so on, and I realized that it was beginning to look very, very like a painting by Turner
Mhm.
called Burial at Sea. And I don't know whether you know that
Yeah,
picture.
I do actually. Yeah.
Yeah, right. Well, there's
Mm.
that black sail,
Yeah.
very light sky. And that was the image that kind of seared itself into my mind while I was looking at this thing go up. And I didn't make any connection in my mind with the fact that it was a funereal thing, there's burial
Mm.
at sea. So anyway, I chose to do that for the image. And I sent it off at the end of 1984, sorry, 85. At the end of 1985, I sent the thing off in a crate to Washington and waited for the response from Bob Schulman. Meanwhile, uh, Columbia, which was it, Columbia? Oh, I can't remember which one it was now. The shuttle that blew up.
Oh, yeah.
I can't remember which was it was. I think it was Columbia, but it may not have been. Anyway, that happened on January. What was it? January, February? I can't remember. It happened, and it was devastating for everybody concerned. And Bob Schulman, who was the guy who'd commissioned me, he had been there when it happened. They were friends of his.
Yeah. It was Challenger. I just had a look.
That's it. Yes,
Yeah.
thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, and he stayed down at the Cape for a few days after this event. In fact, what happened was my painting got stuck in customs
Ah, right.
and it wasn't released until the end of January.
Right.
He came back to Washington and he phoned me up from Washington saying, I've just opened your crate with your painting.
Mm.
And you've called it Aftermath T plus 60 seconds. That's very unfortunate.
Yeah. Oh,
And he said, I don't know what you're trying to do to my head, but I have to say it knocked me back on my heels a bit, because
yeah.
that's within a few seconds of what actually happened. And this funereal thing called Aftermath, and I thought,
Oh, right. Yeah.
what have I done? but it was very, very strange. And I
Mm.
can't explain it, I mean, it's just one of the dreadful coincidences.
Yeah.
Anyway, yeah. So now the point, what I wanted to mention about this was that when I came back to England, it was only when I got back and I thought about, I'd done the painting and so on, and I thought about it and I thought, actually, that wasn't really a very creative way to deal with that brief, which had been completely open.
Mm.
I could have done anything. And I thought I didn't do really, I didn't do myself justice with the image.
Yeah.
And I kind of it really well, it was okay, but it just didn't fulfill me.
Yeah.
Um, and it was about that time that my I took my wife on a hot air balloon journey on her 40th birthday. And that happens in the early morning when the sun is very low. And we were flying over a, a field that was near our local football ground uh, at about 500 feet. And the lowness of the sun was casting these very long shadows on the ground. And I noticed as we flew over this field, I could see the outlines of buildings just under the surface of the grass.
Ah,
Only see because of the shallowness of the light.
yeah.
Yeah. And I was absolutely stunned by this because it showed that there was a complete history visible just under
Mm.
the surface, but which I was unaware of.
Yeah.
And it went right into me, and I kept on thinking about this idea of the secret history. And I realized that that is what I should have done for NASA. You know,
Mm.
they send these satellites up and so on and circumvent the Earth dozens of times, and there must be the most wonderful visual records of what lies just under the surface of the Earth's crust.
Mm. Yeah.
Old mountain ranges, deserts that have covered over habitations, and all of this sort of stuff. And and there I was with this kind of ready-made visual language, which I call the secret history of the Earth,
Yeah.
which would have been exactly right for NASA, but too late for that. So anyway, uh,
I first became aware of your work on, I bought a ZX Spectrum. Well, I got one for Christmas when I was about 14 or 15. And I didn't realize at the time it was your artwork on the manuals.
oh yes, yes, yeah,
Yeah.
like Clive Sinclair's,
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah, 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 yes. That actually, Clive Sinclair was a very, very useful guy to know at that time. He was everywhere.
Hmm.
Until he did the C5, he was
Yeah.
he was absolutely everywhere. And he became a bit of a collector of mine. And in fact,
Hmm.
it was because of him that I got into making large scale work.
Right. Yeah.
And I did a triptych for him that was visible when you got out of the lift in his penthouse in London. The lift would open and there would be this massive triptych painting, 15-foot long painting of a spaceship. And it did me no harm at all to have an association with him. I mean, it's tremendous, really. And he was very generous. Yeah. Yeah. It was.
Yeah. What sort of doors did he open for you? If
Sorry,
you,
what else?
yeah, what sort of doors did he open for you, would you say?
Well, I that's not so easy to measure, actually. I mean, Alex is probably the one to ask them for that one, but it's just simply that I was in the sort of the stream of image making that people were picking up on, like
Yeah, yeah.
Scott and so on. And it had a sort of cachet. It was so much of the time. It was I was just really lucky. Really, really lucky that all of the things that I was able to do were perfectly suited for that particular time.
Yeah. Would you say it was a golden age for illustration, sort of the 70s and 80s for science fiction?
Uh, yeah, that's tricky. It depends what you describe as the golden age, really, because I mean, from my point of view, I've always felt that there was something a bit chintzy about science fiction before that time.
Yeah.
You know, it was comic strip, and it had that flavor, which a lot of people like, and I'm not, you know, it's just not my thing.
Hmm.
Because I am an absolute born romantic. I mean, in many respects, my pictures almost belong more in the 18th and late 18th century, you know, 19th century than the contemporary idiom. But in some of the respects. But yes, I think it's the spirit of it. You know, it's this thing. It's well, it is the romantic idiom, you know, that I am that first and foremost, and it just so happens that nothing could be more romantic, in my opinion, in the mind, than space travel. I mean, it is so romantic. It is,
Yeah.
you know, it's a spiritual thing, you know, and I don't mind using that word. I don't, you know, I use it quite a lot, really, because that's the truth, you know, as far as
Yeah.
it's a spiritual thing. And in many respects, I think that the people who were doing science fiction along with me, they picked up on some of that as well, but it got subsumed by the sheer quantity of the comic strip art. You know, it just swamped everything. You know?
Yeah. Yeah.
I suppose that's how I feel about it still, really.
Why do you think the sci-fi idiom so captured the imagination of the world and has continued for more than a century now?
Yeah. I was always dreading that you'd answer me that because you know you'd ask me that because you did ask me what I wanted to be asked, and ah, the thing this is a big one.
Right. Okay.
It is a big one for me because I think that we are now living in an age when everybody right across the planet is aware of the fact that they live on a planet.
Yeah.
Now, this has been brewing for a long time, you know, and from the days of the late 18th century, late 19th century up until now, it has become increasingly in the forefront of our awareness. And when I look at the sky, I am totally aware of the fact that I'm looking out into space.
Hmm.
It's not a cloudy day for me. It's simply there's vapor hiding deep space, you know,
Yeah.
and that the blue is merely the threshold of the infinite.
Hmm.
Now, I think that whether consciously or unconsciously, everybody knows that, everybody feels it. And we are at a threshold, for better or worse, of losing our sense of being bound in the body and the earth,
Right.
for better or worse. You know, I think that there's some things about it, the way that a lot of people might respond to it and react to that is quite negative.
Yeah.
But from my point of view, and this probably is because of the way that I've lived my life for the last 50 years or so, I can't separate it from a heightened awareness, from a broader, a deeper, a more spiritual awareness.
Yeah.
And that the two are not separate, you know, that actually what we're looking at when we look at the sky is the soul of the earth.
Yeah.
I mean, you know, this sounds ridiculously airy-fairy, but that's the truth, you know, and to me, um, and I can't separate the sense of expansion from the horizon, from the sense of the horizon. You know, the horizon is it's where we want to be, it's where we want to go, you know, it's where the whole of the human heart is aimed, you know,
Yeah.
sense of the horizon and beyond. To boldly, what's it? To go boldly go where I don't know. But you know, I think that's why Star Trek was so popular because it actually said those very things, you know, and you know, the fact that Spock um, became an icon of the 20th century, really, and
Mm,
in my opinion, the reason is that he reflected perfectly the what's the German word Weltanschauung, the spirit the spirit of the world.
yeah,
He reflected it perfectly, and I think that science fiction sort of polishes the knobs. It's sort of
yeah, yeah.
at least it can. I know that there's a lot of storytelling that goes on in that idiom, which is not so, what you might say, sublime. But I think on the whole, what we're looking at is a self-portrait of the Earth, really,
Yeah.
science fiction, and we love it. We love the Earth and everything that it promises.
Yeah.
I can't really put it any other way, I don't think.
No, that's good. And have you got any artistic, because you've achieved so much in your career, is there any artistic goals that you're still aiming for?
Yes, I mean, I would love to be able to generate a body of work which captures the face of the earth without any form as such. I mean, this is really what Rothko tried to do, I think, to
Hmm.
some extent. And I suppose I would love to be able to dispense with the relative picture making and just go straight for the heart, as it were, with I suppose what would be stuff similar to Rothko in a way. I think that kind of sense of silence that comes from beautiful color. Or
Yeah.
um, I don't know, no more than that. I don't think. But I'm getting a bit old for that, I think. And I'm not so suicidal as he is. As he. Yeah.
Well, thanks for the chat, John. It's been really interesting.
Well, I hope that you got something out of it. I mean, all I can say is, that I'm just speaking it as I see it, really, and
Mm,
yeah, I hope it does mean something to someone. Yeah, yeah.
perfect. Well, thanks again, John. Thank you. Thanks for joining us.
It's a great pleasure, and thank you very much for asking me.
My pleasure, mate. You take care. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye bye.